Hello, how are you? Here I will help you sleep with a crime story that has happened with the sound of comfortable rain. Of course, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel for the good of all of us. Let's get started. Story 1. On December 17, 2002, the body of 4-year-old Zachary Longo was found in Winslow, Oregon, when it washed up on the shore of the Alsea River. Zachary had been drowned to death, as had his sister, 3-year-old Sadie, who was found a mile offshore in the Pacific Ocean. His mother, younger sister Madison, and his father, Christian Longo, were nowhere to be found. Today we're going to unpack the twisted story of the Longo family that was bound together by religious conviction, and that was ended brutally by a narcissist who could quite literally only think of himself. Christian Longo was born Christian Michael Stewart on January 25, 1975, to Joy and Stephen Stewart. He spent the first 4 years of his life in Iowa, where he was constantly terrorized by his alcoholic father. The abuse extended to Joy as well, who was just a teenager by the time her first son was born. She eventually had another son with Stephen, whom she named Dustin. This might have made things even worse in the already tense household, with Stephen's violent rage making Joy feel unsafe in her own home. Ultimately, she decided to leave him and got a job at Target to support herself and the kids. Life as a single mother couldn't have been easy for her, but things started to get better when she met a man named Joe Longo. They both worked at Target, and Joe seemed to take an instant liking to the kids. Not long after, he proposed to Joy and adopted Christian and Dustin as his own. Things got quiet for a time after that. Joy was promoted to district manager, and Joy was able to spend more time with her children. But during the years that her oldest son had spent by himself, either hiding from his abusive father or waiting for his mother to come home from her full-time job, something festered inside Christian Longo's mind. He came to be obsessed with appearances, insisting that people only ever see the best side of him. And if he didn't really have anything good to show the world, he wasn't afraid to lie and cheat his way to getting those status symbols he'd always desired. A major change came to the Longo household when Joy received a visit from Jehovah's Witnesses. Up until that point, she'd been a lapsed Catholic with no intention of going back to church, and she'd raised her boys accordingly as well. However, something about the message brought to her by these door-to-door proselytizers resonated with her, and she decided to become a Jehovah's Witness herself. Joe seemed to be all for embracing religion, and pretty soon the kids were being taught to live according to the ways of Jehovah's Witnesses as well. Part of this meant that they couldn't really associate with non-Jehovah's Witnesses, something that may have increased the sense of isolation that Longo felt from the outside world. But at the same time, Longo found himself entranced by the charismatic way of speaking he witnessed at the Jehovah's Witness gatherings he attended. It's possible that this inspired his ability to instantly switch on the charm later on in life, an ability that would get him into more trouble than you could imagine and put him on a path that would lead to unspeakable violence. For now though, Christian Longo was just a regular teenager, or at least seemed like one, and just like any teen, he wanted to start dating. Unfortunately, his parents made this pretty difficult for him. Mary Jane Baker was born on April 22, 1987, in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Unlike her future husband, she came from a big family, although the couple would eventually bond over being the children of divorced parents. Jim and Susan Baker divorced in 1973 when Mary Jane was 7 years old, a split that was potentially caused by Susan's sudden conversion to Jehovah's Witness. Jim apparently didn't agree with this new religious lifestyle, and the couple parted ways. Mary Jane decided to follow her mother into the Jehovah's Witness way of life, and by the early 90s, she was working as a secretary at the dental school at the University of Michigan. There weren't that many Jehovah's Witnesses, at least back then. It was a very tightly knit community, and as a result, the arrival of a new Jehovah's Witness family was a bit of an event. That's exactly what happened when the Longos moved to nearby Ypsilanti, Michigan in 1990. Joe had just gotten promoted to regional manager, which meant moving all the way from Iowa to Michigan. The family quickly integrated into the local community and attended Kingdom Hall meetings as often as they could. It was at one of these meetings that Mary Jane met Christian and started to fall for him. By the time Christian met Mary Jane, he'd become more isolated than ever before. The conversion to Jehovah's Witness had greatly limited his social circle, and moving to a different state meant that any friends he'd had since childhood had been left behind. To make things worse, Christian wasn't even going to school like other teenagers. Since his parents preferred to homeschool him, to keep him away from the rest of the world's corrupting influence. It bears mentioning that Mary Jane was 25 years old when she met Christian, who was 18 years old at the time. Despite the age gap, the two felt like they were meant to be together. Mary Jane had been wanting to get married for years, but she just hadn't been able to find the right man. The fact that she could only marry a Jehovah's Witness considerably narrowed down her pool of candidates. But with Christian, she found someone that she could genuinely enjoy her life with, without having to marry outside of her religious group. There was only one problem. Christian's parents were completely against the relationship. They felt like Christian was too young to be dating, and not because Mary Jane was older than him. They didn't want him dating anyone his own age either. They eventually gave him an ultimatum. Either Christian could choose to continue living with them, or he could date Mary Jane, in which case he'd have to move out. Either it was a form of control, or they genuinely felt like their oldest son wasn't mature enough to be in a relationship, and if that were the case, would have been right. Christian knew nothing about the world. He worked part-time while living at home, and had no college credentials to his name. Life could have been very difficult indeed for Christian, but he was nothing if not industrious. At first, he lived with his friends until he finally found a place for himself with some roommates. But he knew that he had to do something big to impress Mary Jane, which happened to be the factor that made him take his first step into a life of crime. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Christian and Mary Jane were in New York for a Jehovah's Witness trip when he finally popped the big question. He gave her a dazzling diamond ring when asking for her hand in marriage. A ring so glamorous that one might wonder how he bought it while working just a part-time job. The answer was that he'd bought the ring on credit, and he had no way of paying the jeweler for it. This would turn out to be a pattern in Christian's life. His expenses always exceeded his income, no matter how much he happened to bring in. But with that said, he seemed to have a knack for paying his debts in the beginning, although his means of obtaining that money was completely illegal. The first criminal incident he was involved in was directly linked to the engagement ring he'd given Mary Jane. He was working at a camera shop at the time, and one day a customer showed up and paid a $108 deposit for a new camera. Christian pocketed the entire amount and used it to partially pay for the diamond ring he'd bought. Why would an 18-year-old put himself in this position? Mary Jane certainly never asked for a diamond ring, or at least there are no reports of her being overly materialistic like that. On the contrary, she may have been fine with a simple promise ring, or some other symbol of their devotion to each other that didn't involve Christian stealing from his employer. But the deed was already done, and it sent Christian Longo hurtling into a decades-long crime spree that he'd be running from for the rest of his life. When Longo stole that money, it didn't take long for the shop's manager to find out. Longo tried to escape justice by quitting his job, but he was eventually caught and convicted of misdemeanor embezzlement, for which he was sentenced to 80 hours of community service. He confessed to Mary Jane about the conviction, but she decided to stick by him. He mattered more to her than anyone else in the world, and she wanted to spend the rest of her life with him. Even the fact that they were barred from hosting their wedding in the local Kingdom Hall didn't dissuade Mary Jane from marrying Longo. Mary Jane Baker became Mary Jane Longo on March 13, 1993. Despite everything that had happened, Joe and Joy wanted to make sure that their son and new daughter-in-law would have a nice honeymoon, so they decided to pay for them to go to Jamaica. When the newlyweds came back, Longo got a job delivering newspapers, but often told people that he actually worked for the New York Times. It was part of a trend of self-aggrandizement that he'd never really get over. He had to make sure people saw him as someone impressive, and seemingly had no concerns about being caught as a liar. And yet, no one really caught Longo, at least not for a few years. He had 3 children with Mary Jane, Zachary, Sadie, and Madison in 1997, 1998, and 1999 respectively. It seems that his criminal inclinations hit a whole new level during this tumultuous time period. Longo ended up quitting his job right in the middle of expanding his family, and took up a much lower-paying job at a company that sold fireplaces and spas. He claimed this was because he wanted to spend more time with his family, but he didn't seem to factor in the reduced income. Him and Mary Jane continued spending far beyond their means, buying luxury cars and even a jet ski, all while their new children brought the prospect of massive expenses down the line. And on top of all of that, the Longos kept taking financial hits from every direction. Madison's birth brought several complications along with it. She was born premature, and had to stay in the hospital for a month to recover. Since their insurance didn't cover the extended hospital stay, the Longos ended up having one of their cars repossessed. There's a chance that this sudden debt pushed Longo off the edge, because about a year and a half later, his entire family would end up dead. At the turn of the millennium, Longo founded Final Touch Construction Cleaning, a company that he'd conduct massive fraud through over the next year. This may have been an attempt at regaining the financial status he'd lost after the massive medical debt he had to pay back, something that also resulted in Mary Jane's car getting repossessed. The fact that his neighbors had seen one of his cars getting towed likely gnawed at Longo's pride. He had to control the narrative however he could, and show people that he could get his wife a car whenever he wanted to. He accomplished this by creating a fake driver's license. One of the things that Longo had splurged on was a computer, scanner, and printer, all of which were quite rare back then. He used these to fake driver's license with the name Jason Fortner, and after getting it laminated, he headed to a nearby car dealership. Mary Jane had told him about wanting a minivan that could fit the whole family, and that's exactly the car that Longo set his sights on. He gave the person at the front desk the fake ID to photocopy, got into the car for a test drive, and never came back. His other vehicle had a vanity license plate which was registered to his name, but not to a specific vehicle. So he simply swapped out the plates and was able to get away pretty much scot-free. By early 2001, Longo was in trouble with pretty much everyone. He'd written back checks, failed to pay workers' comp to an injured employee, and even defrauded his own parents by forging Joe's signature on a credit card. He had lawsuits and potential criminal charges to deal with. But while all of this was going on, Longo also did something that would completely shut him off from the Jehovah's Witness community. He had an affair. It's unclear if this was an emotional affair or a physical one, but it didn't matter. He was disfellowshipped from the Jehovah's Witnesses, and his parents stopped talking to him. Mary continued attending church, but she had to do so without her husband, something that would have been a source of great shame for her. With the walls closing in, Longo decided to make a run for it. He packed up and moved to Toledo, Ohio, where he rented a warehouse with plans to start a new business. He swore to Mary Jane that he'd be good this time. He had a knack for manipulation, and he used it to convince the landlord of the warehouse to accept just 1 month's rent as a deposit, skipping a credit check entirely. It wasn't the first time Longo had charmed his way into an agreement, and it wouldn't be the last. Once he had the space, Longo wasted no time diving into his next scheme. Using a freshly opened bank account, he began cashing forged checks in the names of other builders he'd worked for. It was bold, almost brazen, and Longo didn't even bother to hide his identity while pulling it off. Instead, he leaned into his charisma, acting as though he had nothing to hide. That confidence carried him far, but it was only a matter of time before his schemes unraveled. At the warehouse, he set up a new business, one that revolved around selling stolen goods. His boldest move yet, listing a skid loader worth $30,000 for just $5,000 in a local ad. It didn't take long for this to raise suspicions. This led to Sergeant Paul Hickey, coming to inspect the warehouse after receiving reports of something shady. But even here, Longo's charm proved powerful. He misled Hickey with excuses and a polished demeanor, and the sergeant left without taking further action. Hickey's instincts, however, wouldn't let the situation go. When he dug deeper, he discovered the skid loader was stolen, though the theft hadn't been reported at the time. This led to a full investigation of the warehouse, and the findings were damning. A stolen trailer, a boat, and another trailer. By the time the police pieced it all together, the Longos had vanished, leaving chaos in their wake. The Longo family didn't stay in one place for long. They traveled across the country, camping out and living off money from Longo's endless string of scams. When they finally settled down in Yakutsk, Oregon, they rented a home with cash, explaining their inability to use credit cards by claiming the cards were maxed out. It was a believable excuse, one that likely drew sympathy from their new landlord. But the story didn't hold up for long. Unable to afford the rental home, the Longos eventually moved into a motel in Newport, Oregon, a further step down in their precarious situation. For a brief moment, Longo tried to maintain the appearance of a respectable life. He landed a part-time job at Starbucks, relying on his charm, secure the position despite having no prior experience. He even managed to snag a promotion to full-time, all while spinning an elaborate lie about working for Quest Communications to bolster his image. As if that wasn't enough, he went on to rent a condo in Newport, despite having no realistic way to pay for it. That's when he decided to end things with his family once and for all. Chris felt that his life would be much easier if he didn't have a family to take care of. In November of 2001, he decided to kill them. He began with Mary Jane, who he strangled her in cold blood, along with their 2-year-old daughter Madison. He stuffed their bodies into suitcases and discarded them in the water, but the horror didn't stop there. With his wife and youngest child already gone, Longo took his remaining children, 4-year-old Zachary and 3-year-old Sadie, to a nearby bridge. He tied weighted pillowcases to their ankles, threw them into the water while they were still alive. After murdering his entire family, Longo did what he always did, moved forward as though nothing had happened. He stole a Dodge Durango from a car dealership by driving it straight out of the showroom. Then, astonishingly, he returned to work at Starbucks for 2 more shifts. The lies flowed as easily as ever. He told friends and his landlord that Mary Jane had left him, taking the kids to the airport. For a time, he kept the horrific truth hidden behind his usual charm and deceit. The truth, however, was already beginning to surface. On December 19th, Zachary's body was found in the water. A friend of the Longos recognized him from a drawing released by the news, leading police to make the connection. A dive search uncovered a pillowcase filled with rocks, a grim confirmation of how the children were killed. Days later, 2 housekeepers found items in a dumpster behind the motel, where the Longos had stayed. Baby books, Mary Jane's driver's license, children's clothes, undeveloped film. Each discovery a breadcrumb. On the trail of destruction Chris Longo had left behind. On December 27th, divers found the suitcases containing Mary Jane and Madison beneath the Embarcadero Marina. Both had been strangled. As the net tightened, Longo fled. He cashed a paycheck, left Newport, and headed south to Cancun, Mexico, where he adopted a new identity, Michael Finkel, a real New York Times journalist. He stayed in a hostel, charmed a German photojournalist named Janina, and even collaborated with her on an article about Mayan mysticism. For a brief moment, it seemed like he'd found a way to reinvent himself entirely. But his crimes had caught up to him. On January 12, 2002, an episode of America's Most Wanted aired, featuring Longo's story. Tips poured in, hostile visitors and tour guides in Tulum recognized him, and local police arrested him there. Even in his final moments of freedom, Longo negotiated demanding immediate extradition to the U.S. to avoid time in a jail. At his trial, Longo's lies grew even more elaborate. He pleaded guilty to killing Mary Jane and Madison, but claimed Mary Jane had killed the other children, prompting him to retaliate. When Madison showed signs of life, he said he killed her too. His lawyers advised against this defense, but Longo ignored them, as he often ignored advice that didn't serve his ego. The jury wasn't swayed. They convicted him of first-degree murder for Zachary and Sadie, and sentenced him to death. Story 2. War is war. I don't know what can I say. I think I probably had about the same sentiment as any other soldier. You know, hey, I don't like to kill, but sometimes it can't be avoided. It wasn't a war. It wasn't a war, and nobody appointed you, and you weren't a soldier. I was. On December 24th, 1985, the Goldmark family were preparing for Christmas Eve, getting ready to host a dinner when they heard their doorbell ring. They thought one of their guests had come early, but they were wrong. That was the last time anyone would answer that door. When their guests did arrive, they walked into a house painted in blood, the family tied to chairs, handcuffed, heads bashed in and stabbed. They didn't have any enemies. No one could have imagined something like this happening to a sweet neighborhood family. But it did, and today we're going to piece together the timeline of what really happened on that fateful night. The Goldmark family seemed to have it all, or at least that's what everyone around them believed. Charles Goldmark, a well-respected lawyer with a knack for winning cases, and Annie, his supportive wife who juggled a teaching career with raising their 2 sons, Derek and Colin. They lived in Madrona, one of Seattle's more upscale neighborhoods. From the outside, they were exactly what you'd expect, 2 bright, well-behaved kids, a beautiful house, and parents who appeared to have it all together. But the Goldmark family had a political past that would be their undoing, and not even because of them, because of someone else's idea of them. In 1962, Charles was a freshman at Reed College in Portland, a school known for its progressive reputation. At the same time, his father, John Goldmark, was running for re-election as a state representative in Washington. But things took a dark turn. 2 local newspapers published stories accusing John of being a communist sympathizer. It's something that happened every day. Influential. Ashley Holden, editor of the Tanescott Tribune. claimed John was part of a monstrous conspiracy to remake America into a totalitarian state. Holden and his allies spread rumors through newsletters and articles, and even pointed to Charles getting an admission at Reed College, which had recently hosted a speaker, and his mother, Sally Goldmark's brief membership in the Communist Party years earlier. Sally had joined the party during the Great Depression, when she was young and struggling. She believed in its promise to help those in need, but left the group after meeting John. Was strictly anti-communist. Despite this, Holden and his supporters twisted her past, and used it to fuel a campaign that painted the entire Goldmark family as un-American. The accusations stuck. John lost the election, failing to even secure his party's primary nomination. But the Goldmarks weren't about to let the lies go unanswered, so they hired attorney William Dwyer to clear their name, and filed a libel lawsuit against Holden and his collaborators. Hollywood figures who had been targeted with similar accusations testified in support of the Goldmarks. Charles even took the stand to defend his school, saying it was far from having anything to do with communists. The Goldmarks won the case. The judge awarded them $40,000 in damages. But lies don't just disappear so easily. The accusations were passed along over the years, and they made their way towards an anti-communist group known as the Duck Club. By 1985, the old rumors made a comeback, and they would reach the wrong person at the worst possible time. David Rice was a man who believed the United States was on the brink of invasion by foreign troops, allegedly controlled by a Jewish-led communist conspiracy. He thought South American and Korean soldiers were stationed at the borders, waiting for orders to strike. Rice also believed the government couldn't trust its own military to attack American citizens, so it relied on these foreign forces instead. In his mind, it all tied back to a larger plan for a one-world communist government, and he needed somebody to blame. These ideas weren't his own. Rice was heavily influenced by Gordon Jack Moore, a former Army colonel who traveled the country warning about the threat of communism. Moore's speeches and writings appeared in far-right newsletters, some of which circulated in Seattle. Rice treated Moore's words as gospel, and so Rice came to see the Goldmarks as state enemies, and everything he believed was destroying America. Coincidentally, John also had a big role in Washington state politics. He was a 3-term state representative from Okanogan County, while Sally had a controversial past as a former member of the Communist Party in the 1930s. But the damage had already been done. Rice admired Moore so much that he called him after reading one of his articles. Moore's words gave him a purpose, which was something he hadn't felt in a long time, with one failure after another. Born in Durango, Colorado in 1958, he was a loner who dropped out of high school in the 10th grade. He joined the Navy, but didn't make it through boot camp. He got married and had a son, but his wife left him. Even when he found steady work as a welder, it ended with a layoff. By 1982, was in Seattle, living out of his car or staying in shelters. Things changed when he met in Davis, a 40-year-old naturopath. They started a relationship, and Rice moved into her Capitol Hill apartment. Soon after, and introduced Rice to a local group obsessed with anti-Jewish and anti-communist conspiracies, the Duck Club. Its leader, Homer Brand, was an ex-Boeing employee who didn't trust the government and was equally as paranoid as Rice. Meetings often featured things like Moore's writings, and the group's ideas fueled Rice's wild ideas. He felt like he had a role to play for the first time in his life. The Goldmark family came up in conversation at one meeting, and they were linked to the old rumors of their communist ties. So Rice looked them up at the library and read about John, a former state legislator who had been falsely accused of being a communist. But Rice somehow confused John with his son, Charles, and became fixated on the idea that Charles was a communist leader. By the fall of 1985, Rice had now started following the Goldmarks. He staked out their house twice, and even went to Charles's office to see him. Despite all the evidence to the contrary, like the fact that John had been dead for years, Rice convinced himself Charles was a communist. And so Rice put his plan into motion in December, with Davis out of town. He tested a bottle of chloroform on himself for 6 months straight, trying to figure out how long a person would stay passed out when they come in contact. He realized the longest time frame was about 20 minutes. He felt like that was all the time he needed to do what he needed to do. So he bought a fake pistol and 2 pairs of handcuffs. He was ready to act. After Reed College, Charles served as an intelligence officer in the U.S. Army before earning a law degree from Yale in 1973. By the mid-1970s, Charles had settled in Seattle, co-founding his own law firm. But Charles was also involved in Washington state politics, serving as legal counsel to the Democratic Party and playing a key role in Gary Hart's 1984 presidential campaign. What few realized, however, was that Charles's family history ended up tearing his family apart. Rice met Charles at a social gathering through Anne's connections at the Duck Club. It wasn't a long or meaningful meeting, but to Rice, it was all the confirmation he needed. The gold marks represented everything Rice had come to hate. What he believed was the corrupt communist agenda that had infiltrated American society at the time. Rice's obsession with Charles grew from there. He believed that the Goldmark family weren't just sympathizers, but active agents of communism, even though there was never really any solid proof of that being the case. The only former communists in Charles's history were his parents, but they died decades before Charles ever crossed paths with Rice. Rice's belief was based on a mix of misinformation from the Duck Club and his own paranoia. He became convinced that the only way to protect America was to get information out of the moles and eliminate them, seeing his violent actions as a mission to stop the communist threat. His plan was to break into the Goldmark house, take Charles hostage, and coerce him to reveal the names of other communist leaders. But that's not what happened. Rice's violent past. Rice's violent personality comes from years of emotional trauma and bad choices. He grew up in a toxic, unstable environment. His father was an alcoholic, prone to violent outbursts towards his mother. Rice saw this abuse firsthand, and by the time he reached his teenage years, had become accustomed to responding to conflict with anger. At the age of 15, Rice's parents separated after years of issues. His mother left his father, but he was left to fend for himself emotionally. His resentment built up over the years, and by his mid-teens, he was already becoming a problem in school, and more importantly with the law. Rice's first run-in with the justice system came at 18 years old, in 1991. He was arrested for assault after a violent altercation with a classmate. The incident was serious enough to lead to legal consequences, but not severe enough for going to prison. He received probation, and from that point on, his life went down a downward spiral. Rice struggled to maintain steady work. He jumped from job to job, leaving them after violent outbursts or disagreements with his superiors. His temper became his defining trait. He married his first wife and had a son, but the marriage didn't last very long. His jealousy, controlling nature, and quick temper ultimately led to divorce. He later got into a relationship with Anne, who fed his temper by introducing him to Charles. Rice had now started preparing for what would become the ultimate expression of his rage, planning every detail. Rice was an anti-communist, and his political views were at the center of everything. And everything changed after meeting Charles. Rice's plan didn't happen on a whim. It was methodical, carefully thought out over weeks. He didn't want anyone to fight back, and his target was the Goldmark family because he saw them as part of the system, as part of the people who had betrayed him. Being called a communist was not the only thing that irritated him. He also felt humiliated in front of people he believed he could trust. He had to let out his rage. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. By Christmas Eve, Rice had everything planned. He knew the Goldmarks would be at home, surrounded by their family and guests. That was exactly what he wanted. The chaos of a crowded house would give him the cover needed to carry out his mission. At around 7 p.m., stood outside the Goldmark home, holding a white box to make it look like a holiday delivery. A Christmas wreath decorated the front door. When he rang the bell, Colin Goldmark answered. "Charles Goldmark, please," Rice said. Charles came to the door, and Rice pulled out the toy gun hidden behind the box. He forced Charles, Colin, and Derek upstairs to the master bedroom, where Annie had just stepped out of the shower. Charles tried to stay calm, and asked if Rice was after money. He handed over the $14 he had on hand. Rice also grabbed a bank card from Charles's wallet and demanded the PIN. Charles gave him a fake one, but Rice didn't know that at the time. Rice didn't think the children would be at the house, but they were, so they too had to be part of the takedown. For him, there was no other option. After that, he ordered the entire family to lie face down on the bedroom floor and cuffed Charles and Annie's hands behind their backs. They struggled at first, confused and frightened, but Rice remained calm and asked for their bank details. They didn't know who he was or why he was doing this, but that didn't matter. Rice wasn't done yet. He knew he had to make sure there was no chance for them to fight back. At around 7 to 10 p.m., Charles mentioned they were expecting dinner guests at 7:30. The clock was ticking because the guests were about to arrive. The chloroform came next. He used it to subdue the family, rendering them unconscious. There would be no struggle, no noise, just silence, and the vulnerability to what he had planned next. His original plan was falling apart, and there was no time left to extract information from the gold marks. Now everyone in the house could identify him. With no other option left on the table, he ran downstairs panicked, grabbed a steam iron and one of Annie's kitchen knives and returned to the bedroom. Rice beat and stabbed Charles and Annie before turning his attention to the children. Rice beat each member of the family with the steam iron to the head, blowing their skulls open. He thought that would be enough to kill them, but when he went to check the pulse, it was still going. They were all still alive. So he grabbed the knives and stabbed Charles and the children in the head through the cracks he'd formed in their skulls. Annie's skull hadn't cracked, so he ended up stabbing her in the chest to finish the job. He was driven by paranoia and baseless political beliefs, convinced that Charles was both Jewish and a communist, neither of which was true. After it was over, turned off all the lights, disconnected the phone, and disappeared before the police eventually caught up to him 2 days later. An acquaintance turned him in after finding a note Rice had written, confessing to the attack. Rice had also told Homer Brand, his Duck Club leader, that he had dumped the top communist. These delusions, shaped by extreme political ideologies, led Rice to see the gold marks as enemies, deserving of punishment. It was a tragic, senseless act, born from a completely irrational hatred. In his mind, the gold marks were political targets, but to anyone else, they were simply an innocent family with no connection to the extreme views Rice held. The entire attack on the Goldmark family lasted less than 20 minutes. No one heard the screaming. No one saw anything. When Rice was done, he wiped the knife clean, taking with him whatever valuables he could find. Money, credit cards, and whatever he thought would give him some kind of twisted sense of victory. Police were called to the scene hours after the brutal attack. The guests had grown concerned after not hearing from the family for several hours. So it didn't take long for officers to break into the home and discover that the entire family had been murdered in cold blood. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when the Goldmark family didn't open the door when the guests arrived. At first, they didn't understand what was happening, and even though they found it strange, they ended up leaving, only to return when they realized how off everything felt. They rang the doorbell again, and when no one answered the door, a neighbor decided to call 911. By 10:30 a.m., the call came in. The Goldmarks' home was quiet, a little too quiet. The house was locked from the inside. No signs of forced entry. The family was unreachable. A neighbor was equally concerned and sensed something wasn't right. When they focused on the house, they could hear someone moaning in pain. It was Charles. Despite the horrific attack, he and his son Derek had survived. When the police arrived, they saw a horrifying crime scene. Charles, Annie, Colin, and Derek Goldmark were each brutally attacked. There were handcuffs, chloroform, and signs of a violent struggle. The police still couldn't figure out who did this. It didn't take long for investigators to find clues. Chloroform residue and handcuffs pointed to a killer who had subdued and controlled the family before taking their lives. No robbery meant the motive was personal. It became clear. The killer had to know the family. Then came an unexpected break. Authorities traced a delivery van to the scene. At first it seemed strange, but soon it became crucial. The killer had posed as a delivery man to gain access to the house. Following his movements revealed a timeline and interactions with the Goldmarks, all pointing straight to Rice. The aftermath. When Rice was arrested, the investigation turned darker. He initially tried to deflect any suspicion, but he eventually broke down and confessed to his crimes. In his confession, he revealed that he'd convinced himself the Goldmarks were communist sympathizers. This was fueled by extremist groups like the Duck Club that led him to believe Charles was working against the country, and his mother's ties to communist parties in the past only fed his suspicion. His confession showed his cold, calculated hatred. Rice described how he meticulously planned the attack, believing that he was eliminating a threat to the country by killing the Goldmarks. Despite his lawyers pushing for an insanity defense, was convicted on 4 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. A decade later, that sentence was reduced to life in prison without parole. One of the more eye-opening moments in the trial came when clinical psychologist Kenneth Muscatel weighed in. Hired by Rice's defense team, Muscatel sat down with Rice for 5 sessions, each about 2 hours long. His report wasn't pretty. Showed schizoid and paranoid symptoms, and he heard voices that forced him to act. But according to Muscatel, that wasn't the trigger for the murders. Muscatel pointed to something else: Jack Moore's writings and the influence of people in Rice's life. And Davis and Homer Brand from the Duck Club. Rice has also admitted himself that he first learned about the gold marks at a Duck Club meeting, and this was where his paranoid fears about an imminent communist threat began. As Muscatel put it, Mr. Rice didn't come up with these ideas on his own. He was part of a group that not only believed in them, but validated them, treating them as rational and crucial. Story 3: The Alboran, Covarrubias, and Valdez families, 7 people, including 3 children, were killed execution-style during that home invasion. 2 men were arrested and convicted. On June 1, 2006, Jasmine Alboran was begging her mother, Kim Fisher, to let her visit her father. The parents had been divorced, and Jasmine's life had been split in 2. She really wanted to spend time with her father and his relatives, but Kim was firm on her decision that day. She wanted her daughter nowhere near that house that day. Little did she know, she was saving her daughter's life. That night, all 7 people in the household were killed in cold blood, and at first, no one could understand why. Now, almost 2 decades later, we know more about it, but it remains one of the most heartbreaking cases in history, and today, we've gathered all the dark details behind it. The Alboran family was a close-knit, multi-generational household living together at 560 North Hamilton Avenue in Indianapolis. At the center of the family were Emma Valdez, 46, and her husband Alberto Covarrubias, 56, who worked hard to provide a stable and loving environment for their children and grandchildren. Emma was described as a dedicated mother and grandmother who brought the family together, while Alberto served as a steady presence in the household. Their blended family included Emma's children from a previous relationship, Flora Alboran, 22, and Magno Alboran, 29, along with the couple's 2 young sons, Alberto Jr., 11, and David Wright. Flora's son Luis, just 5 years old, was the youngest member of the household. The family was known in their community as friendly and connected, participating in local events and fostering relationships with neighbors. The children attended nearby schools, and their home was often a hub for family gatherings and celebrations. Their Hispanic heritage influenced their lives, bringing cultural traditions and customs into their home, which enriched their family bond. Despite life's challenges, they worked hard to ensure their children had opportunities for a brighter future. Education and resilience were key values that Emma and Alberto instilled in their children. The couple took the tough hand life dealt them and somehow turned it all around. They always had the doors of their home open to anyone who wanted to join them. They didn't realize that one day, someone would walk into their home and make sure no one left. Desmond Turner, a small-time criminal, convinced himself that a large amount of money or drugs was hidden inside a safe in a house on Hamilton Avenue. This belief came from rumors circulating in the local drug scene where Turner was involved. Even though no one really knew the basis of it, they all believed it to be true. Hoping for a quick and easy score, he recruited James Stewart to help with the robbery, believing backup would give them the confidence and strength to carry it out smoothly. Turner's familiarity with the neighborhood may have influenced his choice. He seemed to have some prior knowledge of the family or their home, whether through his personal connections or secondhand information. It's possible someone he trusted misled him on purpose, deliberately pointing him toward this home. Some believe Turner might have pieced together unrelated details, misinterpreting them and convincing himself it was a high-reward target. Driven by desperation, Turner saw this as a chance to escape his struggles. Living a life on the edge with a history of small-scale criminal activity, he was willing to gamble for what he thought would be a significant payoff. For Stewart, agreeing to join the plan might have stemmed from loyalty to Turner, pressure to take part, or his own hopes of benefiting from the heist. Despite their preparation, Turner's plan relied on flawed assumptions and false information. The choice to target this specific home based on rumors rather than verified facts turned what could have been a non-violent robbery into something far worse. Turner's desperation and misguided judgment brought severe consequences, all because of his fixation on striking what he thought was a major jackpot. In the end, the plan, fueled by misinformed ambition, spiraled far beyond what either Turner or Stewart could have anticipated. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. The initial plan set by Desmond Turner and James Stewart was clear and straightforward. Carry out a robbery, not a murder. Their objective wasn't to hurt anyone, but to steal whatever they could find. particularly focusing on a safe they believed held cash or valuables. They had no intention of leaving behind any witnesses or creating a violent scene. All they wanted was to get in, get the valuables, and get out quickly before anyone noticed they were there. The house at 560 North Hamilton Avenue was the target. Their primary concern was getting in and out without drawing attention. But they were underprepared for the series of events that would unfold. Turner and Stewart anticipated that the house would be empty, or that anyone present would be an easy target to overpower quickly. They may have thought that the family would be away, or at least off guard, allowing them to carry out the robbery without interference. But once they entered the home, the unexpected happened. Within moments of being inside, their plans started to unravel. The presence of others in the home, combined with a quick confrontation, immediately changed the dynamic from one of a typical robbery to something much more complicated and dangerous. What had seemed like an opportunity to score big with minimal risk soon spiraled into something much darker. However, as they started to search the house for the safe, the situation quickly became more intense. The unexpected return of Magno Albrin turned the entire plan upside down. Magno had just come back home when he found two strangers inside. Unlike what Turner and Stewart had probably expected, he was armed. He felt an immediate need to protect his family, and in a split second, he drew his weapon. This shift caught the robbers by surprise. Up until that point, things seemed easy. Now they faced an armed threat that forced them into a corner. In a tense and unpredictable moment, Stewart acted on instinct, shooting Magno in defense of himself and his accomplice. After Magno fell, Turner and Stewart's options dwindled rapidly. With the one man in the house now dead, the fear of being caught or identified was at the top of their list of concerns. It's at this point that the robbery transformed into something far worse. Instead of fleeing or retreating, Turner likely made a decision based on panic. He might have realized that leaving any witnesses alive could eventually lead to their capture. Fearing the consequences of leaving the scene and not fully understanding the extent of the consequences of what they had already done. Methodically, Desmond Turner moved through the house, targeting each family member he came across with a chilling sense of purpose. His actions unfolded without hesitation. He was trying to eliminate any potential threats in his path. Flora Albrin, Magno's sister and a young mother, was one of the first to encounter Turner. The young woman, who was just trying to care for her family, was instantly confronted with the brutality of the situation. Turner didn't show her any mercy. Her life was taken quickly as Turner continued his relentless and cold execution of his plan, each family member becoming another victim in the nightmare that had unfolded. Next, Emma Valdez, the Albrin family's mother, and her husband, Alberto Covarrubias, tried desperately to protect their loved ones. Both of them understood that something horrific had taken place and knew they had to act fast to stop it. They made an attempt to fight back or intervene. They wanted to protect their family at all costs, but their efforts were futile. Despite their bravery in the face of the overwhelming violence, they were quickly overpowered. The violence Turner brought with him was overwhelming and swift, leaving no time for the family to defend themselves or make a plan. Every movement was executed with precision, marking the house with blood in a matter of minutes. Turner, unable to see any way out now that the family members were no longer a potential source of resistance, continued to move with a sense of finality. There was no attempt to make the scene anything less than what it was, an indiscriminate, cold-blooded killing spree. It was clear that no one would survive this house on Hamilton Avenue that day as Turner carried out each execution with brutal efficiency, securing the tragic fate of those who tried to fight back. Most devastating of all was Desmond Turner's decision to eliminate even the youngest members of the family, leaving no one alive. Alberto Jr., only 11 years old, David, who was 8, and little Luis, just 5, had no chance against Turner's cold determination. The innocence and vulnerability of the children made them helpless in the face of the overwhelming violence. What might have been a robbery that spiraled out of control quickly devolved into a mass murder, marking the house with unspeakable tragedy. Turner's ruthless actions stripped the Albrin family of their future, severing the lives of 7 people in one shocking, unforgiving moment. The family members understood the violence happening around them, unable to escape it. They were all shot executioner style, so they saw their assailant up close and knew what was happening. This massacre was not driven by pure hatred, but by a cold, calculating desire to cover his tracks, no matter the cost. The loss of control over the situation, paired with his unwavering decision to keep killing, ensured that the entire household would never walk out alive. The spree lasted only a few minutes, but its impact was immeasurable. Turner and Stewart destroyed an entire family. After carrying out the brutal murders, Desmond Turner and James Stewart attempted to flee the crime scene as quickly as possible. Their primary goal at this point was to escape without leaving any trace that could be used to identify them or connect them to the massacre. That's the main reason they even went through with it in the first place. The two men made their way out of the house, likely in a hurried panic, still reeling from the violent acts they had just committed. In the chaos that followed, the robbers didn't take the time to cover their tracks, but they made sure to leave the area as quickly as possible. They left the Hamilton Avenue house without further interaction with the outside world, making their way to their vehicle to drive away and go into hiding. Turner and Stewart had already planned their escape, knowing they needed to lay low for a while. In the days following the killings, they scattered and kept a low profile, hoping the police would focus on other possible suspects rather than immediately drawing connections to them. However, the killers were eventually tracked down thanks to a combination of physical evidence, witness testimonies, and diligent investigative work. The investigation into the massacre was initially slow, given the lack of obvious clues at the crime scene. As the bodies were discovered and autopsies revealed the brutal nature of the killings, the police began looking for potential links to local criminals. Turner, with his criminal background and prior connections to the neighborhood, became a person of interest for the authorities. His involvement in local drug circles, combined with his known associations, brought him under suspicion. The breakthrough came when authorities pieced together information from multiple sources. Witnesses who had seen the two men near the crime scene before and after the murders helped put their identities together. Additionally, physical evidence, including fingerprints or DNA, was found at the scene, pointing investigators directly to Turner and Stewart. When they matched this information with witness statements, they were able to link both men to the crime and issue warrants for their arrest. Eventually, Turner and Stewart were found and taken into custody. Their arrest followed an intense manhunt, and once in custody, both men confessed to the killings. But that was just the beginning. The aftermath of the Hamilton Avenue massacre brought not only grief and fear to the local community, but also the legal proceedings that followed, which exposed both the shocking nature of the crime and the strategies used by both the prosecution and defense. Desmond Turner, 31, and James Stewart, 33, faced a variety of charges related to the murder of 7 people, including charges of murder, confinement for each of the victims, robbery, and burglary. As the two men stood accused of an extraordinarily violent and deliberate series of killings, the legal landscape was marred by a long and contentious trial, the handling of witness testimonies, and both men's claims of innocence. Turner was considered the mastermind behind the killings, both in terms of planning and execution. He faced nearly 24 charges, ranging from murder to robbery. His trial began in October 2008, when the Marion County prosecutors presented their case. The prosecution's approach was methodical, laying out the robbery plot that led to the murders. Witness testimonies from those who had seen Turner and Stewart before and after the killings painted a clear picture of the men's movements, directly implicating them. According to the state's case, Turner and Stewart broke into the home at 560 North Hamilton Avenue with the intention of robbing the residents in search of a rumored stash of cocaine and money. The horrific events that followed were not spurred by any direct threat to Turner or Stewart. Rather, they resulted from their decision to eliminate anyone who might recognize them or who could pose a risk to their escape. On November 20th, 2008, Desmond Turner was found guilty on all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Throughout the trial, maintained his innocence. He argued that he was merely in the wrong place at the wrong time and was unfairly implicated in the deaths. This, however, did little to sway the jury or the judge, who had ample evidence to confirm Turner's role in the killings. One crucial aspect of Turner's trial was the fact that he faced the possibility of the death penalty just weeks before his trial began, an option that was ultimately dismissed in exchange for Turner waiving his right to a jury trial. Turner chose to have a judge rule on his guilt rather than risk the uncertainties of a jury trial. This move has since drawn criticism, with some questioning whether he made the choice because he feared a jury's verdict, which could have been more unpredictable. One of the significant challenges faced by the state in prosecuting Turner was the lack of physical evidence directly linking him to the crime scene. While prosecutors could piece together the events through witness statements and circumstantial evidence, they struggled to find concrete DNA or other physical proof tying Turner directly to the murders. This gap in the physical evidence provided Turner's attorneys with the grounds to challenge the prosecution's case, but it was not enough to sway the judge's decision. To counter the lack of physical evidence, prosecutors emphasized the witness testimonies, which painted a vivid picture of Turner and Stewart's actions before, during, and after the crime. Several witnesses had seen them near the house and could describe their actions, providing essential details that helped bring clarity to the robbery and the subsequent murders. James Stewart's trial was set to begin after Turner's, with jury selection scheduled. Unlike Turner, Stewart opted to have his case heard by a jury of 12, plus 4 alternates. Stewart's defense strategy differed significantly from Turner's. While Turner had pleaded guilty to his role in the murders, Stewart stuck firmly to his claim of innocence, opting instead to challenge the evidence against him and present a defense based on an alibi. His attorney, Richard Buchery, argued that Stewart was not present at the scene on the night of the murders and sought to cast doubt on the reliability of the testimony that connected Stewart to the crime. This alibi defense placed the focus of Stewart's legal fight on trying to discredit the state's witnesses. Although Stewart had an opportunity to provide his defense, the evidence against him remained strong. Prosecutors believed that Stewart's handgun was responsible for at least one of the fatal shots, while the rest of the bullets came from Turner's assault rifle. Despite the overwhelming nature of the evidence, Stewart's defense attorneys hoped to manipulate the legal process by throwing doubt on the testimonies and presenting an alternative narrative to the crime. Turner's defense attorneys tried to exploit a long-standing neighborhood feud to inject reasonable doubt into the case. Specifically, they pointed to a feud involving Valdez's son, Mario Albrin, who had no direct involvement in the incident but had been caught up in a dispute with another local family. Turner's lawyers claimed that the Albrin family's ongoing problems with local residents could have led to a mistaken accusation and false witness testimonies. However, Judge Robert Altus dismissed these theories, pointing out that the defense had failed to provide a reasonable alternative theory of innocence. This weakened the defense's argument, making it clear to the judge that the actions and motivations behind the murders were not as ambiguous as Turner's lawyers tried to portray. One of the more complex aspects of the legal proceedings was the decision to hold separate trials for Turner and Stewart. This decision stemmed from the fact that both defendants had different roles in the crime, yet witness statements implicated them both. In cases where multiple defendants are involved, there is always the challenge of handling shared evidence in a way that does not unfairly implicate one defendant based on the actions of another. Because of this, the judge decided it would be best to hold the trials separately. This also allowed Turner to waive his right to a jury trial in exchange for prosecutors not seeking the death penalty, while Stewart's trial proceeded with a jury of 12. Turner, hoping to avoid the worst punishment, went with a judge who might be more inclined to consider his case without the bias of a jury's emotions. Stewart, however, opted for the uncertainty of a jury trial where his fate would be in the hands of the people rather than a judge. 7-year-old Jasmine Albrin's life was forever altered. She had repeatedly begged her mother to allow her to visit her father, Magno Albrin, that fateful night, but Jasmine was told she couldn't go. It was a decision that unknowingly saved her life. The following morning, her mother, Kim Fisher, received a phone call informing her of a horrific event at the home of Jasmine's father and his family. At that address, the worst mass killing in Indianapolis's history had taken place, with 7 people, including Jasmine's father and several close relatives, gunned down by 2 men who had been told of a rumored stash of money. Kim rushed to inform Jasmine, shattering her daughter's world. Jasmine, now an adult, said, "I went from this happy, carefree kid to someone I didn't even know." The sudden, brutal loss of almost her entire family left Jasmine in shock, and she struggled to understand why the massacre had occurred. The trauma not only changed her emotional state, but her entire outlook on life. The grief didn't cease with the conviction of the killers. Jasmine's family was left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. For over a year, Jasmine's mother, Kim Fisher, kept her daughter confined within the walls of their home, unable to find the will to leave. Over time, with the help of therapy and medication, the pain began to subside, though it would never be fully gone. Kim and Jasmine leaned on their faith to help navigate the monumental grief. Jasmine learned that her father and his family would have wanted her to forgive and move on rather than become consumed by the pain and anger from their violent deaths. I don't live with evil in my heart, Jasmine said as she reflected on her ability to forgive the men responsible. On August 23, 2008, just over 2 years after the killings, the house was set on fire in an arson attack. The deliberate act of destruction was likely meant to erase the physical reminder of the massacre that had shocked the entire community. The house was left to burn, with its walls no longer a home, but instead a shell of a horrific past. Ultimately, the house was demolished on July 16, 2010. The decision to destroy it was part of the effort to remove the last remnants of the traumatic event. What had been a place of family gatherings and memories was reduced to rubble, offering no trace of its violent past. But something this dark can't really be fully erased. Story 4. This is not Christy that I know. It's just not. Deputies say both 22-year-old Taylor Sheets and 17-year-old Madison Sheets were shot by their mother, 42-year-old Christy Sheets, a mother killing her own children. Now that's something we don't come across often in true crime, but when it does happen, you know it's not your average story. Unfortunately, today's case is no exception. It's a tale so twisted and haunting that even 8 years later, it still leaves media outlets, the public, and investigators stunned. So once again, we're going to dissect every detail of the case and uncover why Christy Sheets did what she did. For starters, let's take a closer look at the woman at the heart of this case, Christy Sheets. On the surface, especially through her social media, Christy appeared to be the picture of a loving, caring, and proud mother. She was very open about her love for her daughters, often sharing photos and stories on Facebook about how much joy being a mom brought her. But there's more to her story than what you see on social media. At 2016, Christy was 42 years old, and her husband Jason Sheets was 44. The couple had been married for more than 20 years. Originally from Decatur, Alabama, they had moved to Fools Here, Texas around 2002, settling into a beautiful brick house on Remsen Hollow Lane in a quiet suburban neighborhood. Together, they had 2 daughters, Taylor, who was 22, and Madison, who was 17. Taylor, the older of the 2, was a young woman with a bright future ahead of her. In 2016, she had just graduated with honors from Lone Star College and worked full-time at a daycare facility in Katy, Texas, called Kids Are Kids. Taylor was also a talented artist, known for her sense of humor, her independent spirit, and her plans to marry her high school sweetheart, Juan. The couple had been engaged for 4 years and were set to marry on June 27th. Madison, Christy's younger daughter, was about to enter her senior year at Seven Lakes High School. Her friends and family remember her as a sweet, innocent girl with a big heart. Madison was passionate about cooking and loved to be around children. Much like her older sister, she had a contagious sense of humor and was loved by everyone who knew her. For the past 3 years, Madison had worked part-time as a babysitter and even dog-sat for her neighbors. Jason Sheets, Christy's husband, was the hard-working provider of the family. He worked as an IT consultant for an oil and gas company in Houston, and on top of that, tutored students in his spare time to make sure his family had everything they needed. Neighbors remember Jason as a friendly, outgoing person who was always willing to lend a hand in chat when he was outside. However, Christy wasn't known for being friendly or social. While Jason and the girls would often wave and speak to the neighbors, Christy was more distant, preferring to stay out of neighborhood gatherings and social interactions. This made her come across as cold and standoffish to many people in the neighborhood. What stood out about this case was the 2 very different opinions people had of Christy. Many from her past remembered her as a proud and loving mother. They recalled how she loved talking about her daughters, often pulling out her phone to show pictures and brag about their accomplishments. She seemed to find immense joy in being a mother and took pride in her family. However, there was another side to Christy that some people mentioned. They described her as emotionally distant and somewhat unpredictable. It became clear that while some saw her as a devoted mom, others saw a more complex and perhaps troubled individual. Understanding Christy Sheets, her background, her mindset, and the events leading up to the tragedy is key to understanding the actions that led to the horrific events of that day. By going back into her life and examining every detail, we can better understand why Christy did what she did. Growing up in Alabama, Christy was raised by her grandfather, who was like a father to her. You could see from her posts in 2012 that she had a deep admiration for him. She described him as the person who gave her the love and attention she craved, someone she turned to for everything. From her words, it was clear that he was the center of her world, and the love she felt for him was immense. But Christie's relationships, in general, seemed to lack depth. She didn't have many people she could rely on besides her grandfather. In May of 2012, Christie visited her grandpa in Decatur, Alabama for his 82nd birthday. She posted about how thankful she was to her husband, Jason, for allowing her to be there. She also expressed guilt about being in Texas while her grandfather was so ill in Alabama. Then, exactly 1 month later, on June 8, 2012, Christie's world came crashing down when her beloved grandfather passed away. Her social media posts during this time reflected her devastation. There were constant updates about how much pain she was in and how she couldn't stop crying. She marked the days since his death and even had a post in November of 2012 where she admitted that she couldn't gather the strength to go into a grocery store because the grief was overwhelming. Just 2 months after her grandfather's death, Christie's mother passed away as well. But interestingly, her mother's death didn't seem to affect her as deeply. She posted once about how sad it was that her mother passed away so young, but then quickly went back to posting about her grief over her grandfather. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Jason, Christie's husband, later shared in an interview that after her grandfather's passing, the woman he married was gone. According to him, Christie sank into a deep depression and her drinking became excessive. This started to take a toll on their marriage, which began to unravel. The once strong bond they shared began to crumble under the weight of her mental health struggles, alcoholism, and the grief she was unable to cope with. As Christie's downward spiral continued, the Fort Bend Sheriff's Office was called to the Sheets family home a total of 14 times since January of 2012. 3 of these calls were for emotional distress, where Christie had threatened to commit self-harm. On each occasion, Christie was taken to a private medical facility and held for several days. But once she claimed everything was fine, she was released and sent back home. According to Jason, this cycle would repeat itself time and time again. By this point, and Jason's marriage was hanging by a thread, they would separate, Christie would move into an apartment, and then they would reconcile, creating an unstable and volatile situation. In 2014, during one of the couple's many separations, Christie discovered the world of selfies. Prior to this, her posts had a mix of family pictures, but after 2014, it was nearly all selfies. Now there's no doubt that Christie was a stunningly beautiful woman who appeared to be even more striking in her 40s than in her 20s. However, instead of simply embracing her beauty, it became clear that she was searching for validation. The comments on her selfies revealed that she was seeking approval and trying to fill a void. It seemed like the more she posted, the more desperate she became for attention and affirmation. According to Jason, Christie struggled with low self-esteem and harbored deep self-hatred, which negatively affected her relationships with him and with their daughters. Additionally, Christie would often make passive-aggressive comments to their daughter Madison, like telling her, "When I was your age, I was this size." She would even try on Madison's clothes and make references to her size, undermining her daughter in subtle, yet damaging ways. These little comments weren't just occasional. They seemed to be a part of Christie's ongoing struggle with her own insecurities. It's also important to note that, based on Christie's Facebook posts, she was a vocal advocate for gun rights in the United States. In one post, she expressed her strong beliefs about the Second Amendment, emphasizing her support for the right to bear arms. Fast forward to 2014, Christie got a job as a receptionist at a tattoo removal company owned by John Hollis. However, John described Christie's behavior as erratic. There were many times when she simply wouldn't show up to work and wouldn't even bother to call in. Christie told John that she was in the process of a divorce and living in an apartment separate from her family. John eventually looked up Christie's LinkedIn profile and noticed she was misrepresenting herself. She had listed herself as the business manager of the company when she was actually just a receptionist, and she claimed to have been working there for 2 years when, in reality, she had only been there for 5 months. John confronted Christie about the misinformation and asked her repeatedly to fix it, but she never did. 5 months after starting with the company, John ended up terminating her employment. Interestingly, he said that Christie took the news surprisingly well and that the termination was amicable. By June of 2016, Jason and Christie had reconciled from yet another separation, but things were already starting to fall apart again. According to Jason, Christie was taking multiple medications for her mental health struggles, and was seeing a therapist once a month. Additionally, Christy and Taylor, the older daughter, had been fighting constantly about Taylor's upcoming wedding to her fiancé Juan. Then on Friday, June 24th, which also happened to be Jason's 45th birthday, things took a darker turn. From the moment Christy woke up, she was at odds with everyone: Madison, Taylor, and Jason. The atmosphere in the house was filled with negativity, and Jason eventually reached his breaking point. Jason, after a long day of arguing, told Christy he wanted a divorce. He bluntly told her Christy, who had been pushing for a divorce for months, saw this as the final straw. But the situation didn't end there. Christy demanded that Jason ground Taylor from seeing her fiancé Juan. Jason, however, argued that it was ridiculous. Taylor was 22 years old, an adult. He refused to control his daughter like that, which only made Christy angrier. Their relationship had been hanging by a thread for so long, and now it seemed like everything was falling apart. Madison, who was close to both her sister and mother, was feeling the tension as well. She spoke with a high school friend around 9 o'clock that Friday morning, and her friend noticed that Madison was acting strange, anxious, and distant, and unwilling to share many details. Madison only said that she and her mom had been arguing, but nothing more. It was clear something wasn't right, and the day was about to get much worse. Around 5 o'clock in the evening, Christy, in a fit of rage, called a family meeting. She demanded that Jason, Taylor, and Madison sit down and talk. Jason thought Christy was going to address the divorce with the girls, but instead, she dropped a bombshell. Christy demanded an apology from Jason, but he refused. That's when Christy completely lost it. In an outburst of fury, she reached under the couch cushions and pulled out a .38 caliber shotgun, one that her grandfather had left her to protect the family. The room fell into silence. Jason and the girls froze, unsure of what was happening. In a desperate attempt to protect his daughters, Jason screamed, begging Christy not to shoot them. He even pleaded with her, saying, "Don't do this. There are kids." But his words fell on deaf ears. He then said, "Just shoot yourself. Make it easy on all of us. Just shoot yourself." Christy, however, coldly replied, "No, that's not what this is about. This is about punishing you." Naturally horrified, Jason tried to bargain with her, promising he would do whatever she wanted if it would stop the madness. But Christy wasn't hearing it. "No, stop talking," she snapped. "It's too late." Somehow amidst the chaos, they managed to call 911 not once, but twice. But what's truly heart-wrenching is that in the calls, all you can hear are their terrified screams and desperate pleas, begging their mom not to pull the trigger. With that, she turned the gun on Madison and shot her in the neck, then turned to Taylor and shot her in the back. The terror that followed was unimaginable. Jason somehow managed to get around the couch and helped his daughters escape through the front door. But Christy wasn't done. She fired 3 more shots, missing the girls but hitting the wall. Madison made it out to the street, but collapsed from her injuries almost immediately, dying right there on the pavement. Christy followed Taylor out into the street, and as Taylor collapsed too, Jason ran to a neighbor's house, frantic and desperate, begging them to call 911. She's going inside the house now. Hopefully, she's not getting any more bullets, because she looks like she's going to look for more bullets. "Okay. All right. Stay on the line. She's coming back again. She's coming back again. Apparently she has bullets now. Okay. Stay on the line. She shot her again. She shot her again. She shot her again. Yes. From the back. She's trying to run." As you've just heard, not long after Christy had reloaded and returned outside, despite her critical injuries, Taylor managed to get up and attempted to flee. It appeared as though Christy was preparing to shoot Madison again, even though Madison had already died. At that moment, officers ordered Christy to drop the gun, but she failed to comply, and instead, she moved toward the officers. One officer fired, hitting Christy with a single shot to the chest, ending the threat. Taylor was rushed to a nearby hospital by life flight, but she was in critical condition and died shortly afterward. Jason, physically unharmed but deeply traumatized, was taken to the hospital due to the shock he was experiencing. He had witnessed the horrifying deaths of his daughters at the hands of the woman he once loved. His mental and emotional state was shattered, and the entire community, along with family and friends, struggled to comprehend the depth of the tragedy. The details were coming to light, and it left many stunned. The shocking events took place in Fulshire, Texas, where the Sheets family lived. Neighbors were trying to make sense of it all, and they demanded answers. What could have led a mother to kill her own daughters? That's the question everyone wanted answered. Maternal filicide, the act of a mother killing her own children, is rare but devastating. It's considered one of the most challenging forms of homicide to prevent, as it often comes with little to no warning. In this case, the signs were subtle but present, and the aftermath left everyone, from friends and family to the community at large, grappling with the incomprehensible loss of two bright lives. As previously mentioned, Christie's actions seemed to stem from a deep desire for vengeance against her husband, Jason. What made this tragedy even more chilling was that Christie had the opportunity to harm Jason while they were inside the house, but she chose not to. Instead, she targeted their daughters, Taylor and Madison, as a way to inflict the ultimate emotional pain on him. Jason later gave an emotional interview with Dr. Oz, where he opened up about the overwhelming grief he was struggling to cope with. The raw pain in his words was palpable, as he shared how his faith had become his anchor in the midst of such unspeakable loss. When asked about his daughters, Jason described them as lights of joy in a world full of darkness. He spoke of how they had pure love and joy in their hearts, always extending kindness to people of all backgrounds, races, and religions. Their vibrant spirits and bright futures were tragically snuffed out far too soon. In the interview, Jason also shared the deep void left in his life, especially when he recalled how his daughters used to encourage him during his runs. "When I can't get another breath, I think of them, and it pushes me to run a little faster," he said, finding solace in their memory as he carried on with his life, even without them by his side. Juan Taylor's fiancée was also interviewed by Dr. Oz, and his words were equally heartbreaking. "There's really no words to describe the hell I go through every day, knowing I won't get that good morning text from her," he said. He shared the pain of losing the woman he was ready to marry, and how he could never have picked a better person for his daughter than Juan. But the devastation didn't end with the family. The police officer involved in the tragic shooting of Christie Sheets was also deeply affected by the events. Fort Bend County Sheriff Troy Niels weighed in on the situation, reiterating that the officer acted appropriately given the danger Christie posed at the time. Despite the necessity of the officer's actions to protect others, Niels emphasized the emotional toll it had on him. "There isn't an officer that wakes up any morning and says, 'I want to go out and legally kill somebody,'" Niels told People magazine. He added that the officer's struggle to come to terms with taking a life was real and profound, highlighting the emotional and mental impact of such incidents on those who are sworn to protect and serve. Taylor and Madison's sheets were laid to rest on July 2, 2016 at Limestone Memorial Gardens in Athens, Alabama. Their father, Jason, chose not to claim Christie's body, leaving it to her family to handle the arrangements. Reports suggest she had a private service in Alabama and was cremated afterward. After everything that went down, Jason packed up and moved back to Decatur, Alabama. Within a year, he remarried, trying to piece his life back together after such a devastating loss. But let's talk about what's really on everyone's mind. Story 5. I'm sorry, the Cowden family did not get justice, and I was a part of their not getting justice. These were the words of an officer who once investigated a family massacre so brutal, so disturbing, and so heartbreaking, that even now, justice remains just out of reach. We're talking about the Cowden family disappearance, which quickly turned into one of the most horrific massacres Oregon has ever seen. What happened to this family was so random and shocking that by the end of this video, you'll wish they had never been found, because the terrifying truth about their deaths is even more tragic than anyone could imagine. For starters, let's get to know who the Cowden family were. Richard Cowden, 28 years old, was a hard-working man who dedicated his days driving logging trucks through the dense forests of Oregon. His wife, Belinda, just 22, was a loving mother to their two young children, 5-year-old David and their baby girl Melissa, who was only 5 months old at the time. The Cowdens lived in White City, a small town in southern Oregon, and like many families, they often sought out the beauty and peace of the nearby wilderness to get away from everyday life. So, in 1974, they decided to make a spontaneous trip to Carberry Creek near Copper, Oregon for the Labor Day weekend. As you can imagine, this wasn't a case of a family venturing into the woods for the first time, blindly setting up camp in the middle of nowhere. No, the Cowden family were locals. They knew these woods like the back of their hands. Richard, Belinda, and their kids had spent plenty of time in the forests and towns around Copper, Oregon. They knew the land well and had always felt safe there. Now, the trip itself was actually a bit last minute. Richard had originally planned to work on the driveway that weekend, but when those plans fell through, the family decided to take a break from the routine and head into the great outdoors. They packed up their car with their trusty basset hound Droopy in tow, and made their way to the campsite near Carberry Creek. Carberry Creek was located in a quiet, remote area not far from Copper, Oregon. But it's important to note that Copper wasn't much of a town at all. It was small, consisting of only a handful of houses and a general store. In fact, the town would cease to exist just a few years later, in 1980, when a dam was constructed on the Applegate River, flooding the area. Their plan for the weekend was straightforward. They would drive out to Carberry Creek on Friday, camp for 2 nights, and then on Sunday stopped by Belinda's mother's house in Copper for a visit. Afterward, they planned to head back home to White City. The weather was perfect, sunny and clear with not a cloud in the sky. Everything seemed set for a relaxing and enjoyable time away. But as with many stories like this, things didn't go according to plan. The details of what transpired during the camping trip are unclear. No one knows exactly what the family was up to while at the campsite, though it's generally believed they were enjoying their time there. On Sunday morning, the day they were supposed to head home, Richard and young David were last seen, at around 9 a.m. at the general store in Copper, which was only about a mile down the road from their campsite. They had stopped by to pick up some milk and a few other supplies, as most families do while camping. But after that, they vanished without a trace, and no one would see them again. According to sources, it was Belinda's mother who first realized that something was wrong. As mentioned earlier, Richard and Belinda had planned that they would stop by her mother's house for dinner before heading back home. So when dinner time came, and they didn't show up, Belinda's mother grew concerned. She had prepared the meal, expecting them, but as time passed and there was still no sign of the family, she decided to drive to the Carberry Creek campsite to check on them. Remember, Richard and David had gone to the general store that morning to buy some milk, which meant that Belinda and the baby were back at the campsite. Could something have happened while the 2 men were away? By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day. So if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. When Belinda's mother arrived at the campsite, she found the family's pickup truck still parked by the side of the road, just where they had left it earlier. But as she walked into the campsite itself, her sense of unease grew. Everything seemed to be in place, as if the family had only just left. The camp stove was set up and their belongings, including the family's truck keys and Belinda's purse, were all right there in plain sight. Even a half-full carton of milk, bought earlier that morning, was sitting on the picnic table. Even more chilling was the discovery of Richard's wallet, which contained $21, roughly the equivalent of $135 in 2024. Alongside it was his prized Rolex wristwatch, an item that seemed like the first thing to be taken if this was a robbery gone wrong. Yet, it remained untouched. Alongside these items was an open pack of cigarettes, identified as belonging to Belinda. Strangely, the family's bathing suits were missing from inside their truck, hinting that they had planned a return trip, possibly to the water, before their sudden disappearance. Belinda's mother spent some time calling out for the family and checked the nearby river, hoping to find some clue to their whereabouts. But there was no sign of them anywhere. All their personal belongings were left behind in such a way that it didn't make sense for them to have just gone off for a short walk or a quick errand. If they had, they would have taken their essentials like the purse and keys. The more she thought about it, the stranger it all seemed. If they had gone for a quick hike or drive, they certainly wouldn't have left their stuff behind, open and exposed, where anyone could come across it. By now, the unsettling feeling had settled in. No signs of an accident, no tracks, no evidence of a struggle. Just an eerie emptiness. Belinda's mother returned home and immediately contacted the Jackson County Sheriff's Office. Soon after, the troopers arrived at the campsite only to find it just as Belinda's mother had left it, everything in place, but no sign of the family. There was no blood, no violence, and nothing out of the ordinary. The situation was described as creepy and unnerving. No one knew what to think. Naturally, the rumors began. Some speculated that maybe Bigfoot had made its presence known, claiming yet another victim. After all, the mystery surrounding the disappearance, combined with the eerie setting, left room for all sorts of strange theories. The next morning, a full-scale search began for the Cowden family, triggering one of the largest search operations in Oregon's history. But prior to this, the Cowden family's pet basset hound, Droopy, showed up alone, scratching at the door of the Copper General Store. The dog's return without its family made it clear that something had gone terribly wrong, and this case would be discussed by media outlets nationwide, including the New York Post, and become one of the most perplexing and haunting chapters in the state's history. The search involved helicopters with infrared technology, search dogs and teams scouring caves, woods and waterways, all while locals, hunters and volunteers combed the surrounding areas. Despite the intensity of the search, nothing was found. It seemed as if the Cowden family had simply vanished without a trace. The police didn't stop at physical searches. They interviewed over 150 people in hopes of uncovering any clue about the family's whereabouts. But still nothing came up. The community also refused to give up, though. A reward of $2,000, about $12,602 today, was offered for any information that could solve the mystery. Richard Cowden's sister even took to the Medford Mail Tribune, writing a heartfelt plea for hunters to stay vigilant. She hoped that even the smallest clue could help solve the mystery of the family's disappearance. The push for answers didn't stop there. Over 200 people wrote to Oregon Senator Mark Hatfield, urging him to get the FBI involved. Unfortunately, their request was denied. The reasoning? There was no evidence to suggest that the family had been kidnapped or taken across state lines. As time passed, investigators wondered if there could be a connection between the Cowden family's disappearance and other unsolved cases in the area. 8 women had gone missing around the same time, under similarly mysterious circumstances. The investigation took a chilling turn when it was revealed that these 8 disappearances were attributed to the notorious serial killer Ted Bundy. What did this discovery mean for the Cowden case? Did it shift the investigation in a new direction, or was it just another layer of complexity added to an already puzzling mystery? As autumn turned to winter, then spring, the mystery deepened. The families and community members who had been searching were left with more questions than answers. It wasn't until April 12, 1975, more than 7 months after the Cowden family vanished, those 2 young gold prospectors, working near Sturgis Fork about 7 miles east of Carberry Creek, made a discovery that would provide a chilling conclusion to the Cowden family's disappearance. While searching the forest floor, they first spotted scattered bones, but as they looked up, they saw something far more chilling, a skeleton tied to a tree. Surrounding it, more bones were scattered across the forest floor, suggesting this had been a grisly crime scene for some time. Terrified by what they had found, the men quickly fled and contacted the police. Authorities arrived swiftly, securing the area and beginning their investigation. They soon confirmed that the skeleton was indeed Richard Cowden, identified through dental records. The location was now a crime scene, one that seemed more like something out of a horror movie. The police continued their search, determined to find the rest of the Cowden family. Not far from the tree where Richard's body had been found, they discovered a cave hidden behind a pile of smaller rocks. After carefully moving the rocks aside, they entered the cave and made an even more disturbing find: the bodies of Belinda, David, and baby Melissa. The Cowdens had been found, but the reality of what had happened to them was even worse than anyone had imagined. Examinations of the remains revealed the horrifying truth. Belinda and her young son, David, had been shot in the head with a .22 caliber rifle. Little Melissa, only a baby, had suffered fatal head injuries, likely from blunt force trauma. Richard's body, tied to the tree, showed no signs of bullet wounds or firearm-related injuries. Instead, his cause of death was believed to be either stabbing or strangulation. However, it remained unclear whether he had died before or after his wife and children. One theory briefly emerged that Richard had killed his family and then taken his own life. But this idea was quickly dismissed. How could he have done that if he was found tied to a tree? Additionally, the murder weapon, a rifle, was never recovered, further suggesting that someone else was responsible for the brutal killings. Whoever committed this gruesome act was likely familiar with the area, possibly even someone with intimate knowledge of the wilderness. What made this discovery even more disturbing was the fact that the very area where the bodies were found had already been searched back in September. Just a week after the Cowdens disappeared, there was no one in the area at the time when the search happened. The man who had previously searched that same spot confirmed it. He could even point out the exact cave he had checked, stating that the Cowden family wasn't there when he looked. So what did this mean? It suggested that the Cowden family, all 4 of them, had been held hostage somewhere else for about a week before being brought to that spot, possibly after the initial search had died down. It seemed they were still alive when they were brought there, only to be killed. The discovery of shell casings at the scene pointed to the fact that they were likely killed right at that spot. The police were desperate to talk to anyone who had been in the area around the time the Cowdens were believed to have been abducted. Some campers had seen Droopy, the family's dog, wandering a couple of miles from the campsite, but they thought nothing of it at the time. The dog eventually made its way to the Copper General Store. Meanwhile, an elderly family from Los Angeles had arrived to camp at Carberry Creek on Sunday, September 1st. After the Cowdens were abducted, they reported seeing 3 people, a man, a woman and another man, in a pickup truck near the campsite. The family found them unsettling, feeling like they were waiting for someone to leave before they packed up. Could this have been Richard, Belinda, and the killer? Was the killer holding them at gunpoint in the truck? At this point, the mystery of the Cowden family's disappearance had everyone baffled. The family had no known enemies, and were actually well liked by their community. Yet there was one person who stood out as a potential suspect, Dwayne Lee Little. Investigators still believe he may have been involved, and his chilling background has kept this suspicion alive over the years. In 1974, Dwayne was just 25 years old and lived in the small town of Rush near the dense forests of Oregon. What made his story even more disturbing was the fact that he had been released from the Oregon State Penitentiary only 4 months before the Cowdens vanished. Dwayne had spent years in prison for the brutal assault and murder of a teenage girl, Orla Faye Phipps. At first glance, Dwayne appeared to be a model citizen, charming, good-looking, and even serving as class president. But his dark side was revealed when Orla, a neighbor, went for a horseback ride one day and never returned. After a search, her body was found, and the world learned of the terrible crime he had committed. But what was truly chilling was that no one really knew why he did it. Orla had been an innocent teenager, and Little's motives for such a horrific act remain a mystery to this day. He served a 10-year sentence before being granted parole. According to his mother, he suffered serious head trauma as a child, a common factor among many notorious criminals. On top of that, it's believed his mother's behavior towards him was psychologically damaging, not through physical abuse, but by manipulating his emotions and actions. This troubling home life may have shaped his violent tendencies in the years to come. After serving time for the brutal crime he committed against Orla, Dwayne was released in May of 1974. He moved to Medford, Oregon, where he worked in a warehouse and lived with his parents. Strangely, his parents' house was just a short distance from the Cowden family's campsite near Carberry Creek. During Labor Day weekend that year, Dwayne was reportedly in Copper, but when questioned by the police, he denied ever meeting the Cowdens or having any knowledge of their disappearance. But there was more to his story. His girlfriend at the time, who came forward after Dwayne cheated on her, told police that he owned a .22 caliber rifle. This raised some serious questions, because convicted felons like Dwayne were not allowed to possess firearms. What made this even worse was that 2 of the Cowden family members had been shot with a .22 caliber rifle. The most puzzling part, though, was Dwayne's refusal to take a polygraph test when questioned about the Cowden murders. The officers told him that if he passed the test, wouldn't be sent back to prison for illegally possessing a firearm. Yet, Dwayne still refused. This only fueled suspicion and led to him being sent back to prison for violating his parole. He would be released again in 1977. In 1980, Dwayne's violent nature resurfaced in a chilling way. A pregnant woman named Margie Hunter was his next victim. Her car had broken down near Portland, Oregon, and Dwayne, pretending to be a good Samaritan, offered her a ride. But instead of helping, he attacked her, strangling, stabbing, and assaulting her. Miraculously, Margie survived the brutal assault and was able to identify Dwayne as her attacker. It was later revealed that they had worked together, which made her identification of him even more certain. Dwayne was convicted for this crime and sentenced to 60 years in prison. Now, if you're still not convinced that Dwayne Little might be the killer of the Cowden family, here's something that could make you rethink. Remember the testimony from the elderly couple who reported seeing a truck with a man and a woman in the front and another man in the back. They said the woman appeared to be crying, which gave them a creepy feeling. Well, it was later confirmed that the truck matched the description provided by the couple, and it was actually Little's family's truck. To make things even more unsettling, while Dwayne and his parents denied any involvement or knowledge of the Cowdens' disappearance, a miner who owned a nearby cabin revealed that Little and his parents had stopped by on Monday, September 2nd, 1974, and even signed a guest book he kept for visitors. This was just a few days after the Cowdens went missing. Even more damning, while serving time for a different crime, an inmate named Rusty Kelly, who once shared a cell with Dwayne Little, claimed that Little confessed to him that he was responsible for the Cowden family murders. Despite this and the overwhelming circumstantial evidence, Little has never been formally charged in connection with the murders. It's a haunting mystery, with so many pieces that seem to point in his direction, but no clear resolution, and to this day, the remaining family of the Cowden family still holds out hope that someday justice will be served. Dwayne is now 75 years old and serving his sentence at the Oregon State Penitentiary. Story 6. It's no secret that Japan is one of only 2 advanced nations in the group of 7 alongside the United States that still enforces the death penalty. What's more, the vast majority of the Japanese public firmly supports it. And when you hear about this case, it's easy to understand why. The brutal murder of the Matsumoto family wasn't just unjustifiable, it was so gruesome, so horrifying that it reverberated not just through Japan, but across 2 nations. And by the end of this video, you might find yourself agreeing with the majority. Because trust me when I say, this is one of those cases that will carve itself into your memory forever. To get started, let's get to know the Matsumoto family, the kind of family that looked like they had it all. 41-year-old Shinjiro Matsumoto was a well-known businessman in his town. He lived with his stunning wife, Chika, who was 40, and their 2 young children, a son who was just 11 years old and a daughter who was only 8. Together, they were the picture-perfect family in Japan. They lived in one of the most luxurious houses on their street, and Shinjiro drove a Mercedes-Benz, a rare sight in Fukuoka back in 2003. Their lifestyle was the envy of many, but as with many stories like this, the reality behind closed doors was far from what it seemed. Police investigations later revealed that the Matsumoto family was in a deep financial crisis. For context, Shinjiro had taken over his father's barbecue restaurant at a young age, and worked hard to save enough money to buy their impressive house. But despite his success, Shinjiro had a taste for luxury. He loved cars and spent lavishly, ignoring his father Yoshido's repeated warnings to manage his finances wisely. The family's troubles began when a livestock disease outbreak caused business at the barbecue restaurant to plummet. The restaurant was forced to close for several months, leaving the Matsumotos with no income. Shinjiro then shifted his focus to a clothing store he had opened 3 years earlier, hoping it would be their saving grace. Unfortunately, the fashion industry wasn't as forgiving. Shinjiro lacked experience and made poor decisions, which led to significant financial losses. Despite this, he doubled down by expanding into online sales, investing heavily in stock to sell. But then again, the gamble didn't pay off, and his debt spiraled out of control. By this point, Shinjiro owed a staggering 10 million yen, around $63,000, with just 2 months to repay the debt. He had no way out. His house and car were already mortgaged to the bank, and legal borrowing channels were closed to him. Out of desperation, Shinjiro turned to loan sharks, known for their ties to criminal gangs and their terrifying methods of collecting debts. So with all that being said, this was the first theory formed when the tragedy struck on June 20th, 2003. That morning, at around 6:30 a.m. in Fukuoka, Japan, Shinjiro Matsumoto's father, Yoshido, arrived at his son's house. Like he did every day. But that day something was off. He rang the doorbell a few times, but no one answered. Now, Yoshido lived really close to his son's house, and was super close to his 2 grandkids. He would visit every day to take them to school, and by this time his daughter-in-law Chika would usually be up making breakfast for the family. But oddly, that day was a complete silence. That's when Yoshido's instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. Luckily, he had a spare key to his son's house, so he rushed back to his home to grab it. When he returned and opened the gate, he immediately noticed something strange. The Mercedes-Benz was missing from the driveway. Could the whole family have left earlier than usual? He thought to himself, but the eerie silence didn't sit well with him. Slowly, he made his way inside. As he stepped through the door, he was met with an unsettling calm. The front door was slightly ajar, but there was no one in sight. It was so quiet, it almost felt like the house was abandoned. Yoshido checked around the house, and that's when he saw it. The living room, the bathroom, and the bedrooms were all in chaos. Items were thrown around, like there had been a struggle. But the most disturbing part was the bathroom. It seemed mostly clean, but there were faint red stains. Blood stains. Panicked, Yoshido quickly called his son's workplace, hoping to get some answers. However, the staff at the clothing store told him that Shinjiro hadn't shown up for work yet. That was it. Without wasting another moment, he called the police. and within no time, the Fukuoka City Police arrived at the Matsumoto home. At the entrance, they found odd, disjointed footprints, small bloodstains, and drag marks leading away from the front door. It seemed like someone had been struck down right there. There was blood on the floor, and despite efforts to clean up, the forensic team had no problem finding the traces. The children's bedroom also had signs of a struggle, though not many. What really made things chilling, though, was the bathroom. Blood was splattered everywhere, on the walls, between the tiles. It was clear that someone had tried to clean it up, but they didn't do a very good job. The amount of blood suggested that whoever was hurt there had been seriously injured. At this point, the police confirmed that all 4 members of the Matsumoto family were missing. The house had been ransacked, and everything of value, cash, jewelry, even the Mercedes, was gone. The police's initial conclusion was that it was a robbery. But it quickly became clear that things had escalated to something much worse. Now finding the Matsumoto family was the top priority, whether they were alive or dead. If this was a murder, they feared the bodies might have been disposed of. So the police decided to trace the missing Mercedes-Benz and start looking into Shinjiro Matsumoto's personal and social connections to find any leads that could help solve the mystery. That's how the investigators found out about Shinjiro Matsumoto's significant debt to loan sharks, which led to a theory that maybe the collectors had gone too far in their attempts to get the money back. The police also considered the possibility that in a moment of desperation, Shinjiro Matsumoto himself may have killed his entire family and then taken his own life. This idea seemed to make sense at first, but Matsumoto's father, Yoshida, was not convinced. He knew his son still had some savings, and more importantly, he and his wife owned 2 houses in Fukuoka, along with a house in the countryside. If Shinjiro had asked for help, Yoshida was certain he would have done everything in his power to assist him in repaying the debt. There was absolutely no reason for his son to resort to such extreme actions. Yoshida also pointed out that his son was not the type of person to give up on life. Shinjiro was known to be strong, optimistic, and deeply dedicated to his family. At just 41 years old, Yoshida believed it was unlikely that his son would take his own life. He was confident that the Matsumoto family had fallen victim to a criminal gang of loan sharks, and not that his son had turned violent. As these theories swirled, and many questions remained unanswered, something unexpected happened. Around 6 p.m. on the same day, the investigation team received a new report. 2 workers were operating a tower crane in Fukuoka Bay, where they were moving large container goods. As they went about their work, they noticed something unusual floating in the water. Curiosity got the best of them, so they used binoculars to get a better look, and what they saw shocked them. There appeared to be a body in the water. Immediately they called it in, and the Fukuoka police rushed to the scene to investigate. When they arrived and began their search, the discovery was even more horrifying than anyone had imagined. It wasn't just one body floating in the water, but 4. The authorities quickly began the identification process and soon confirmed the worst. The bodies belonged to the 4 members of the Matsumoto family. The scene was utterly heartbreaking. Among the victims was Matsumoto's youngest daughter, only 8 years old. Tragically, she had been strangled to death. Her face had a large dark purple bruise, which suggested she had been struck with incredible force. The police believed that the person responsible for the violence must have been very strong. The bruise was so severe that they felt even an adult man would likely have been knocked unconscious by such a brutal blow. The 11-year-old son of the Matsumoto family also tragically died from asphyxiation. Bruises were found on his arms and legs, which indicated he had likely been stepped on. The police suspected that there was more than one perpetrator involved in the crime, one person holding the boy down while another used a rope to strangle him. It was a horrific scene, suggesting a coordinated attack. Shinjiro Matsumoto, the father, wasn't spared from the violence either. His body showed signs of multiple injuries, and his head had been struck with such force that it fractured his skull. However, despite these severe wounds, the blow to his head wasn't the direct cause of his death. According to the forensic report, Matsumoto had been beaten severely with numerous fractures to his bones and significant internal bleeding. The medical examiners concluded that while he had been beaten, the cause of death was actually drowning. Matsumoto was still alive when he was bound and thrown into the sea, unable to escape the harsh fate that awaited him. Now the deaths of Matsumoto and his children were tragic beyond words, but it was the discovery of the mother's body that left everyone in shock. 40-year-old Chika Matsumoto's body was found naked, covered in dark bruises, and there's no doubt that she had been assaulted before her life was brutally taken. Chica, once a beautiful and fit woman, was now unrecognizable. Her head had been struck with a blunt object, and the damage to her genital area was severe. What made the scene even more horrifying was the fact that large portions of her flesh, at least 30 patches, had been removed. Forensic experts confirmed that this had occurred while Chica was still alive. The thought of the pain she must have endured before her death was almost too much to comprehend. Experts even compared the killer's method of torture to the ancient Chinese practice of lingqi, or death by 1,000 cuts, which involved slow and agonizing torture. Chica's cause of death was also determined to be drowning, but it was unlikely she had drowned in seawater. Forensic analysis suggested that she might have been submerged in a bathtub before being thrown into the water. The brutality of the crime left everyone involved in the investigation stunned and outraged. The killer's methods were so barbaric that they could hardly be processed by the team working to bring justice for the Matsumoto family. It was at this point that they began to seriously consider Yoshido's theory, that the Matsumoto family had been targeted by loan sharks and other underworld figures as retaliation for unpaid debts. However, as they dug deeper, they realized there were a few holes in this theory that didn't quite add up. First off, the underworld typically values money above all else. They don't kill a debtor until they've collected the debt. Matsumoto owed a sum of 10 million yen, which was a large amount, but certainly not impossible to repay. If he couldn't manage it, his father Yoshido had enough savings to help. In fact, Yoshida would have done everything in his power to help his son pay back the debt. If the underworld was involved, it didn't make sense to them that the entire family would be killed. Typically, they would target the person who owed the money, not their children or wife. This raised suspicions that something else might be at play. Another issue was with the codes of the Japanese underworld. These codes were strict and usually prohibited the killing of a debtor's family. Matsumoto had borrowed from a group with traditional values, where punishments for unpaid debts usually included extreme measures like limb amputation, but never murder. There had never been a case of an entire family being killed over a debt before. This made the investigators question whether the underworld was truly involved. What's even more convincing was the fact that the loan sharks even took the unusual step of approaching the police, repeatedly insisting that they had no involvement in the crime. Their reasoning was that killing the entire Matsumoto family leave no one left to pay the 10 million yen. From a financial standpoint, this argument made sense. The police started to see that there might be a different motive behind the killings. And as the investigation team discussed the case, they started to find some critical clues that pushed the theory in a new direction. The police discovered that all the victims, the Matsumoto family, had been handcuffed and weighed down with objects. This was a method used to make sure the bodies would sink when thrown into the sea. But there was a mistake in the binding technique. Some of the weights came loose, causing the bodies to resurface. That small error provided the investigators with a valuable lead. Upon further examination, the police realized that the handcuffs and weights were actually sex toys, which was a shocking twist. Fukuoka wasn't a large city, and there weren't many shops that sold such items. This made it easier for the police to track down where they came from. But that was only the beginning. The investigators also found DNA from semen inside Chica's genital area, most likely belonging to the perpetrator. They also discovered skin flakes under her fingernails, suggesting that she had fought back with great strength. The skin fragments were from 3 different individuals, which immediately pointed to multiple attackers. Then came another key discovery, several fingerprints that didn't belong to anyone in the Matsumoto family. The police found 7 or 8 different fingerprints throughout the house. And after ruling out friends, colleagues, and family members, they realized that 3 of the prints didn't match anyone they knew. These prints were scattered around the house, suggesting that they belonged to the killers. The police quickly traced the sale of the handcuffs and weights to a small shop just over a kilometer from Matsumoto's house. The shop owner, Mr. A, remembered a customer who had purchased these items the day before. He recalled that the man seemed young, around 20 years old, and appeared to be a foreigner. This was unusual because people who typically buy these items are usually middle-aged men buying them for their wives. The man's Japanese wasn't very fluent, with many mispronunciations, leading Mr. A to believe that the customer could have been Korean or Chinese. However, despite the unusual nature of the purchase, Mr. A described the man as gentle and not someone who looked like a killer. By the way, I post true crime and new cases here every day, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, please consider subscribing. It helps a lot. Now, thanks to the small shop surveillance cameras, the police were able to obtain footage of the suspect. This footage was quickly broadcast on television, hoping that the public might recognize the man and provide further leads. Shortly after the information spread, the Fukuoka police received an unexpected call. A student contacted them and revealed that he recognized the suspect. According to the caller, the suspect's name was Wang Liang, a student at a renowned language school for international students in Fukuoka. What stood out to the police was that Wang's Japanese was poor, which instantly reminded them of something the shop owner, Mr. A, had mentioned. Mr. A had stated that the person who bought the handcuffs and weights spoke very little Japanese and was likely a foreigner. This connection seemed too coincidental to ignore, and it made Wang Liang a prime suspect in the eyes of the police. They immediately began investigating his background, and guess what? They discovered that Wang Liang was only 19 years old and originally came from Chongqing, Jilin Province, China. His family was relatively well off and worked in construction, having spent hundreds of thousands of yuan, around $26,000, sending their son to study in Japan. However, things didn't go well for Wang Liang once he arrived in Japan. His academic performance at the language school was poor, and he was often absent from class. Back in China, he had already been known as a delinquent, associating with bad company. Without his family's supervision in Japan, his behavior became even worse. He began to stand out among the Chinese students, but not for the right reasons. He had multiple altercations with his classmates, resulting in warnings from the school and even threats of expulsion. By May of 2003, Wang Liang got into another fight, which led to his expulsion from the language school. This expulsion also meant that his international student visa was invalidated, and according to Japanese law, he could no longer remain in Japan under the student visa. At the end of 2002, Wang Liang returned to China, falsely telling his family that he was continuing his studies at another language school. His family gave him approximately 190,000 yuan, about $26,000, hoping to support his education. However, Wang's time back in China didn't last long. He returned to Japan on June 10th of 2003, but without any intention of enrolling in a school or following through with a plan for his future. Instead of staying in the school dormitory, he moved into an apartment with his roommate, Yang Ning, fearing that staying on campus would draw attention and expose his lack of enrollment. Once the police had gathered all this information, they decided to send a team to Yang Ning's apartment to investigate further. But when they arrived, they found that both Wang Liang and Yang Ning had recently moved out. Suspecting that something wasn't right, the police quickly checked the immigration records. Their findings were chilling. Just 2 days after the tragic incident on June 20th, Wang Liang and Yang Ning had boarded a flight back to China, which only raised more suspicions and confirmed their worst fears. It appeared that the suspect was trying to flee the country after committing the heinous crime. Because why would Yang Ning leave everything behind, especially when he hadn't been expelled from the language school like his friend? It became clear to the investigation team that there was more to this story. Earlier on, they had suspected that more than one person had been involved in the murders, and now it seemed that Yang Ning might be just as guilty as Wang Liang. So the police started digging deeper into Yang Ning's background to see if they could find something that linked him to the crime. What they discovered was shocking. Yang Ning, just 20 years old, came from a completely different background than Wang Liang. He was also from Chongqing and Jilin, but his family was well off. His father worked as a mid-level city official. Unlike Wang Liang, who often skipped school and wandered the streets of Japan, Yang Ning was focused and responsible, working at a burger restaurant to support himself. The two young men had known each other since they were kids in China, but their relationship grew even closer once they both found themselves in Japan. At first, Yang Ning seemed like a decent person, but the more time he spent with Wang Liang, the more he began to change. Wang Liang was a troublemaker, gambling, drinking and visiting shady places like red light districts and bars run by the Chinese underworld. He would buy sex toys and engage in illegal activities, and soon enough, Yang Ning was caught up in the same dangerous lifestyle. Yang Ning went from being a hard-working, responsible young man to someone who indulged in alcohol, gambling, and even bullying other students with Wang Liang. Despite their growing reputation as troublemakers, many of their classmates couldn't believe that the two could be capable of something as horrific as murder. But the police knew better. They understood that murderers often had a dual personality, appearing harmless and kind one moment, then capable of unspeakable violence the next. With this in mind, the investigators refused to rule out the possibility that both of them were involved in the brutal deaths. And at Yangning's former rental apartment, the Fukuoka police uncovered a chilling collection of evidence. They found numerous hair samples and fingerprints on various items around the apartment. After thorough analysis and comparison, they made a stunning discovery. The DNA from the skin flakes under Chica's nails matched both Wang Liang and Yang Ning. But that wasn't all. The fingerprints from the apartment also matched those found at the Matsumoto crime scene. It was becoming undeniable. Wang Liang and Yang Ning were the murderers. While the Japanese police sought help from Chinese authorities to track down Wang Liang and Yang Ning, who had fled back to their hometowns in China, they kept pressing on. There was still one key question. Who was the third person involved in the crime? DNA from 3 individuals had been found under Chica's nails, and different fingerprints were discovered at the crime scene, meaning there had to be another accomplice. The investigation team quickly turned their attention to anyone closely connected to Wang Liang and Yang Ning. And it didn't take long to identify a new suspect, Wei Wei, another international student from Hunan province in China. Wei Wei, 24 years old, was much older than the other two. He came from a wealthy family, with his parents owning a factory and being well-known entrepreneurs back home. Though his academic performance was average, Wei Wei took his studies seriously. After completing his mandatory military service, his family arranged for him to study abroad in Japan in 2001. As mentioned, Wei Wei was known for his dedication to his studies. He rarely skipped classes or left early unless there was a legitimate reason. However, in the months leading up to the crime, his behavior began to change. He started missing several days of school at a time, offering excuses such as illness, part-time work, or poor mental health. According to some Chinese international students, Wei Wei had suddenly become close friends with Wang Liang and Yang Ning about 6 months before the incident. This new friendship, however, wasn't just about casual bonding. Wei Wei, who had trained in martial arts during his time in the military and won several provincial competitions, started teaching Wang Liang how to fight. Wang Liang had a reputation for getting into fights, but he wasn't always successful, so it made sense that he would seek training from someone skilled in combat. The trio often spent time at bars owned by the Chinese underworld, indulging in drinking and partying. But things had changed for Wei Wei. His once wealthy family faced financial instability, and he couldn't handle the loss of his comfortable life. This shift left him bitter and resentful, which led him deeper into destructive behaviors, drinking to numb his feelings and associating with increasingly bad influences. In fact, in March 2003, Wei Wei and another Chinese national had been involved in a robbery. They stole 260,000 yen from 2 students leaving an internet cafe. The victims knew Wei Wei, but didn't report the crime, fearing retaliation. Then, just before the tragic events in June, a female international student came forward, accusing Wei Wei of brutally beating her over a trivial matter. The police were now convinced that Wei Wei was likely an accomplice in the Matsumoto murders. Fukuoka police acted quickly, conducting an emergency investigation. They discovered something critical. Wei Wei had no exit records from Japan, meaning he was still in the country. To catch Wei Wei, the Japanese government swiftly issued an exit ban and launched an extensive manhunt. However, Wei Wei was one step ahead. He abandoned his residence and vanished without a trace. 2 months later, in August, a break in the case occurred. While shopping at an airport convenience store, Wei Wei got into a heated argument with the staff over a payment issue. This caught the attention of patrol officers who intervened to defuse the situation. Sensing the officer's presence, Wei Wei panicked and bolted, prompting the police to signal for backup. Despite his training in martial arts, Wei Wei could not outrun the authorities. A thorough search of his belongings revealed a plane ticket scheduled for departure in just 1 hour bound for Shanghai, China. Now Wei Wei proved to be a cunning individual. After his arrest, he refused to answer any questions, maintaining a stoic silence. Determined to connect him to the crime, the police extracted his DNA for comparison, and the results confirmed his involvement in the brutal murder of Chica's family. However, the case was far from closed. Wei Wei's silence about the whereabouts of Wang Liang and Yang Ning left investigators frustrated. Without their capture, identifying the mastermind behind the heinous crime remained a challenge. Japanese authorities pinned their hopes on China's law enforcement, anticipating swift action to apprehend the remaining suspects. Japanese media, however, were less optimistic. Many doubted the efficiency of Chinese law enforcement, predicting that the fugitives would adopt false identities and evade capture for years. Some even speculated that Wang Liang and Yang Ning might vanish into the shadows permanently. But surprisingly, just 2 months after fleeing to China, a breakthrough occurred. In Liaoyang, Liaoning province, a man reported suspicious behavior from a new co-worker. The co-worker, he claimed, was excessively lavish with money and often boastful. In fact, during a drunken rant, the man had confessed to committing a horrific crime, murdering an entire family of 4. Chinese police quickly detained the individual for questioning. At the station, the young man appeared visibly shaken, showing signs of severe anxiety. He collapsed at the sight of the officers and repeatedly asked about leniency policies for honest confessions. Under the promise of a lighter sentence for cooperation, the suspect admitted to being Wang Liang. Unlike Wei, Wang willingly revealed the whereabouts of his accomplice, Yang Ning, leading to Yang's swift capture. With both accomplices in custody, Wei finally began to confess to his crimes. Wei started his story by explaining how he met Wang and Yang while trying to make a living in a foreign country. At first, he was a law-abiding student focused on his studies, but life had not been kind. As mentioned earlier, financial troubles plagued his family back home, and they constantly urged him to find work and send money. Meanwhile, Wang and Yang openly bragged about their small-scale thefts. They claimed to have stolen money and belongings from their doormats with ease, always avoiding detection. Wei initially dismissed their stories, viewing them as reckless troublemakers. However, as his financial situation worsened, their words began to linger in his mind. He tried to stay focused, but when his family's pleas for help grew more desperate, he reluctantly accepted Wang and Yang's offer to help him out. One evening, Wang and Yang took Wei to a fast food restaurant where Yang had once worked. They asked him to stay outside while they went inside. Moments later, they emerged with bags of stolen cash, 2,300,000 yen in total. Smiling, they handed Wei 700,000 yen, claiming it was his share. Wei was torn between gratitude and guilt. The money seemed like an easy solution to his problems, but deep down, he knew it was wrong. What started as hesitation quickly turned into temptation. The thrill of how simple the crime seemed was irresistible. The very next night, Wang and Yang invited Wei to join them for another theft. This time, they targeted a teacher's dormitory. Under their guidance, Wei snuck inside and managed to steal 50,000 yen. Though the amount was small, the adrenaline rush and the success of the operation made Wei feel invincible. Over the next 6 months, Wei's behavior changed drastically. He went from being a serious student to someone consumed by greed and recklessness. He participated in scams, stole valuables from fellow students, and even resorted to physical violence when things didn't go his way. Despite being briefly detained for an assault, he was undeterred. The world of crime had taken hold of him. Then came the night that changed everything. Wang and Yang presented Wei with a bold plan to rob wealthy locals, promising it would be their big break. They assured him that with the money they would steal, they could all live comfortably for the rest of their lives. Eager for the riches and blinded by ambition, Wei agreed without hesitation. The group began scouting potential targets, searching for people who displayed signs of wealth, such as luxury cars and grand homes. They soon set their sights on Shinjiro Matsumoto, a man who drove a high-end Mercedes-Benz and lived in a spacious, 2-story villa. For a week, they observed his routine, learning that he and his wife worked during the day while their children attended school. Matsumoto often returned home late, leaving his family vulnerable in the evenings. On the night of June 19, 2003, the trio put their plan into action. They armed themselves with tools, including handcuffs and daggers, before heading to Matsumoto's villa. Breaking in through a window, they found the 2 children asleep while Chika, Matsumoto's wife, was in another part of the house. What happened next spiraled out of control. Overcome by their emotions, the trio acted in ways that went far beyond their original plan. They restrained Chika and, fearing discovery, decided to ensure there would be no witnesses. Tragically, this led to a series of irreversible actions, leaving no one in the house unharmed. As the group searched the house for valuables, Matsumoto unexpectedly returned home. Hearing the sound of his car, they panicked and hid. When Matsumoto entered, they overpowered him and continued their search. However, their efforts yielded only 40,000 yen, a mere fraction of what they had anticipated. The amount, equivalent to about $250, was barely enough to cover basic expenses, let alone their dreams of living in luxury. To cover their tracks, Wei Wei, Wang Liang, and Yang Ning began erasing all evidence. They meticulously cleaned the scene, wiping away bloodstains and footprints. They then tied the bodies of the 4 members of the Matsumoto family to heavyweights, loaded them into the stolen Mercedes-Benz, and drove to the beach. There, under the cover of darkness, they disposed of the bodies in the water, hoping to leave no trace. However, the very next day, the Fukuoka police held a press conference, revealing details of the shocking case. The killers, watching the news unfold, felt a surge of panic. For the first time, they realized how deeply their crime had affected not just the victims, but the entire community. Unsure of what to do next, they began to discuss fleeing Japan and returning to their home country. But for Wei Wei, the thought of going back was unbearable. The shame he felt was overwhelming. He felt like he had lost his way, and returning home seemed like an impossible option. He also believed misguidedly that as an accomplice, he would not face the death penalty if caught. So, he made the decision to remain in Japan, thinking that perhaps the law would be lenient on him. In 2005, Yongning's fate was sealed. He was sentenced to death, and executed almost immediately. Wang Liang, on the other hand, received a life sentence for his cooperation in helping to capture Yang Ning. But Wei Wei's story was far from over. During his trial, he claimed that he was merely helping his friends, and had no intention of committing murder or robbery. He argued that he was swept up in the moment, following his friends without thinking of the consequences. His defense was unsuccessful, and he was sentenced to death as well. Despite his appeals, which he filed twice, the court rejected them, stating that his crimes were just as severe as those of the mastermind behind the killings. The brutal nature of the crimes had left no room for leniency. However, in Japan, death sentences don't lead to immediate executions. They require the justice minister's signature, and with only 1 or 2 orders signed each year, those on death row often have to wait years for their turn. Wei Wei was no exception. Over 20 people were ahead of him in line for execution. For 16 long years, he sat in Fukuoka prison, haunted by his past and forced to reflect on his decisions. During this time, his mother and sister visited him regularly, but his father never came. Wei Wei assumed his father was angry with him for the shame he had brought upon their family. The truth, however, was that his father had fallen seriously ill and could no longer travel to see him. As the years passed, Wei Wei began to change. The anger and defiance he had once felt slowly gave way to remorse. He came to understand the full extent of his actions and how they had destroyed not only his own life, but the lives of the Matsumoto family and countless others. In a moment of clarity, Wei Wei stated that if his death could bring any comfort to the victims, he was willing to accept it. He had lived with the weight of his actions for so long that, in the end, he felt no escape from the consequences. During his long wait for execution, Wei Wei often reflected on his life, his choices, and the path that had led him to this point. What haunted him most was the thought that if he could turn back time, he would have made different choices. He regretted not working harder to understand Japanese and connect with others, a skill that might have allowed him to return home with pride instead of facing death. And in 2019, Wei Wei was finally sentenced to death. While this may have brought some sense of justice, it's impossible to ignore the lingering pain of the surviving family members. Their loss is something that will never fade, a scar that will remain for the rest of their lives. Just like many others, this case has stayed with me, haunting my thoughts for weeks. The brutality, the senseless violence, it's hard to wrap my head around it, as the rain gently falls and the night grows deeper. Thank you for joining me here at Mr. Night Scared. True crime stories remind us of life's mysteries and the importance of staying aware, even as we seek comfort in the quiet of the night. Let the rain carry you to a peaceful sleep, and until we meet again, stay safe, stay curious, and let the night watch over you.